Hey, welcome to Wine Talks with Paul K. And we are peeling the wine business back one label, one bottle, one cork at a time. And always sponsored by the original Wine of the Month Club, where we feature the new Pure Wine Club with purest wines on the planet. I like to say that. But we have a special guest today. I'm having a fascinating conversation. Had to interrupt it actually to start the podcast, and that is with Fabian Castel, who is a Parisian turned winemaker in Ojai, and we have fascinating stories to talk about. So I want to get started. Just welcome to the studio, and thanks for coming in today. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much, Paul.
It's interesting to have a French accent from Ojai who's traveled the world like you have, and I want to kind of peel back some of these stories, but we were just talking about the French language, which you said Adam, the owner of Ojai Vineyards, is a Francophile. He thinks he's a Francophile. We all think we're Francophiles, right? We really don't know if we understand anything.
That word Francophile, I think it has to do not necessarily with the language, but it can just have to do with the culture. In the case of Adam, certainly it's his fascination for the French culture. And when I came in this country, I was very curious about American culture and wondering how different it was going to be. And really, to my not so great surprise, it actually is very different. We have many similarities, but the differences are maybe even more pronounced.
Well, I think clearly in the history, what I've learned by studying French, and this has been about 4 or 5 years now, is the differences. And I get to study, and I know why I was brought up the restaurant, is that I reminded him that Catherine de Medici came from Florence. She was, a queen in Florence, or one of the princesses, and she married a French guy. But she brought the idea of real cooking to France, and he likes to say stuff, well, we also brought lovemaking to France, too. I'm like, I don't think they're going to go off. I don't think they're going to buy that. But I just thought, I love that part of history, like Napoleon and Josephine. By studying the language, I'm able to study the history, and I have fascinating conversations with my father about being frank. They're clearly different cultures, and I think that you want them to be different, and you want the knowledge of this. And
it's good to acknowledge the difference, but also see how we collaborate and influence each other. At the same time that so I came in not as a winemaker. I was just interested in wine, and I learned, actually paradoxically, all my winemaking from Adam Tolmach from the Ojai Vineyard. So I'm like this, weird guy, French guy coming to the United States to learn how to make wine. But
that is kind of weird.
But it's kind of upside down. But you realize that a lot of French winemakers are coming to the U.S. and going everywhere else in the world, and that there is something beautiful. Like, I've learned so much with the American spirit of entrepreneurship, of feeling free to do something that is not following the canon of beauty or the rules and regulation that have been basically established over centuries, if not sometimes millenniums. So it's a mix of freedom of interpretation and entrepreneurship, and the ability to just keep building with great speed and great detail an industry, but in this case a craft.
It's interesting you said that, because I had Jacques Lardier in here. I think we mentioned that earlier, from Louis Jadot, fascinating guy making biodynamic wines for Louis Jadot in Oregon, or at least spearheaded that project at Resonance. And I said that to him. I said, there's something about the foods of France and the districts, and all over Europe. You go to Tuscany and you have foods of Tuscan with Chiantis and Brunellos and things. If you go to the northern part of Italy, you go to Piemonte and you have Nebbiolo, and you have the foods of northern Italy. And when you go to France, it's the same thing. You go to Lyon, which is the food capital of the world, you have foods of that nature, Lyonnaise food, right? And the wines, for me, parallel that. And there's a reason, I think, culturally, why wines grow up with foods. But we don't have that in America, because we don't have any grapes that make wines here, except Concord. And Jacques Lardier said, but that's the freedom of America. It's the spirit of America. You get to start from scratch, and you get to decide what direction this is going to go. And it's a fascinating concept. I'm going to send you a book I just finished called The Last Days of Haute Cuisine. It was written in 2001, a very famous book, won some awards. But it starts with Le Pavillon in New York on 5 East 55th Street, with a very famous French restaurant, and how society has paralleled food and vice versa. And the same with wine, I think. But I want to go back a little bit for you. So we'll talk about your history, because you said you're from Lyon.
Correct.
From
my parents grew up in Lyon.
And so the food capital of the world, of France, Paul Bocuse. What else is over there?
Well, actually, the origin maybe is La Mère Brasier. She's the one, if you look, the great piece of Anthony Bourdain about Lyon and Paul Bocuse.
Which is a great show.
But they pay homage to La Mère Brasier, who before Bocuse was the one that really developed that culture of the bouchon lyonnais, which is kind of this bistro. It's a little bit simpler. It's not actually fancy, but with all the classic dishes from there. And that's relevant for me because really my food culture and wine culture really starts indeed in Lyon, but starts with my grandmother, who was a phenomenal woman who wanted to be a surgeon but couldn't. She went through.
She was a female at that time.
Correct,
yeah.
And she went through 2 world wars. The first one as a nurse, and the second one as a physician. And she became a pediatrician, but she became also very involved in the medical community and very, very powerful.
She was in Lyon or Paris?
Lyon.
Yeah.
But on the side, great cook. So I saw her always cooking. And more important, she would take her car and she would drive up and down to Beaujolais and Mâcon and Côte-Rôtie, Saint-Joseph, and all the way down to Châteauneuf and Gigondas, Vaqueras, Côte de Vaucluse.
Hour and a half, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, up to like 3-4 hours. She would go even in the Provence area. And then she would, in between the 2 wars, go there with Demijohn, and she would buy bulk. And then she would bring all that bulk wine back into her basement,
Really?
And she would hand bottle it and hand label it.
Wow.
And that's how I got to really taste, some Côte-Rôtie from the 30s and
phenomenal story.
Moulin Vent from the 40s
Do you
and 50s.
remember them?
Oh yeah, I mean, I remember many things about wine because it was at every great dinner. At the time I was living in Paris and coming back for Christmas and various different holidays, and so it was not all year long, and I would go to those dinners and wine was a preeminent part of the dinner. It was always matched, and people were really paying attention. They would never comment and talk about it. It was either good or not good.
It was just part of the deal. It
And
was just part of our meal.
If it was good, people would really enjoy and mention it, but if it was not good, it was go get another one.
Yeah.
Or go get a good one. And
we do that today, by the way.
Yeah. But it was very casual, but at the same time there was a real deep intent. And I remember not liking red wine when I was little, and I liked champagne and I liked white wines. And then I remember the first red wine, probably when I was like 12, that struck me, and it was an old Châteauneuf that was from, I think, in the mid 50s.
How fun.
I think it was 54, 55. And I remember even the difference between, they would open, let's say, 5 or 6 bottles of like one wine of one vintage, and some bottles would not be good.
Yeah.
And I would and they would expose me to what a bouchonné or corked bottle was, or one that was overaged or oxidized. And then the one that was singing, and then my grandmother was like just saying, "Yeah, this one is right. You can put it on the table."
It'd be fascinating to find out. And I use the word fascinating all the time. My friends tease me about it, but to find out, the rate. We know the rate of corkage today. You even open a wine that you thought had the beginnings of a corky character. So it had to be more prevalent then, or the corks were harvested at the right time, and so they were less prone to bacteria because they were fully mature, and they corked them then. So I wonder if there's a incidence of corkage that's different from today's problem, since you use a special cork now.
Yeah, that is a good question. I mean, I would think that it was higher, although there is something about the treatment, TCA, that really creates the corkiness, is about the interaction of a fungus and chlorine. So some of the treatment of trying to sanitize the corks have been also part of the issue. although some natural occurrence of a chlor molecule might also do the same thing with a fungus. So we are usually at 4% really that we can really observe of potential of corked bottles.
It got pretty bad around here. It was almost a bottle in a case was starting to go until they started to correct that 15 years ago. But so, let's start with that. You didn't study wine. You didn't have any plans to be in wine. You lived in Paris, or you were born in Paris, and you went to school to study biology, right? Which is a great background for wine, but that's not what you were doing.
No.
What were you thinking then?
I mean, actually, to really circle it back to what it will become, early on, I was very interested in apprenticeship. I really liked the old way of transmission of knowledge. But being in France, you are pushed to really go into the more elitist kind of environment, whether it's for your baccalaureate or graduating high school or then the university. So my thought was trying to go back to this initial idea of apprenticeship. So when I let go of going to pharmacy school, which is how I was going into biology, I did very quick schooling in marketing, basically, and advertising, and didn't even finish the school because I got an internship and I got a job. So I took the job because really that's what I was interested in. I learned early on, basically, that I learned on the spot much better than in theory. And I loved applied knowledge. And I did that for a few years. It was very interesting, and I got to actually have a very good salary, which was very unusual for someone with no real diploma. But, burned out. Paris is, like any big city, very grinding and very intense and very unpersonal or cold. And so I responded the call to adventure. So I went on to this pretty long journey of sailing, and then later on over land through basically the North Atlantic, North Africa, and then South America through Guyana, Brazil, and then ending up in Bolivia.
You just took off.
And did what many people actually, that's an advice I still give to my kids and to many other people. It's like youth needs to travel.
Yeah, I agree.
And a lot of learning that connects with what you were saying about language, and more discussion we could have about like the great interaction of different cultures and how much you learn by being exposed to what you don't know. Chiefly learning to hear and understand people and understand yourself, and in the process also realizing like the great diversity of ways of being out there in the world. My goal there was even more I think intense. Throughout my traveling, I was looking for having a connection to maybe the most ancient still alive culture of humans. Mm-hmm. So that's what really took me to the Amazon.
Really?
And in the Amazon, I got that contact with people.
You could have gone to South Central Los Angeles. It would be the same thing.
That is true. I did not come up with that idea then.
Yeah, no, it's like a rough neighborhood.
But
that's where I grew up too.
But beautifully enough, no, I was looking. I had the same thing in Paris. Actually, you have the equivalent of South Central in the banlieue in Paris. But no, I wanted nature. And I wanted a culture that was living in nature. And I wanted to connect to what does it mean to have an ecosystem that is very complex where maybe humans are not dominant, because that's really what ancestral communities were about. They were in harmony, or at least they were deeply connected to the elements. And so I found it there, and I could have made a life there, but I met this American physician that became a close friend, and we worked together on his medical project. But then his daughter came about, and her and I fell in love, and I followed her to Philadelphia, where she was studying medicine. And it's there that my American journey kind of started.
Wow. We've discussed that briefly, but I met my wife at the Amazon in Bolivia, right? You said Bolivia.
Yeah.
And we ended up in Santa Ynez. And I mean, how serendipitous and how fortunate, right? I mean, you never know where life's going to take you. And here you are. It sounds like you were trying to find yourself to a certain extent, study a little bit about human nature. And I love this concept of where the humans is not the dominant force in that part of the world, and so you learn to adapt to that, right? And you meet your wife.
Yeah, once
future wife, anyway.
Yeah, and that's the other advice to young people is that when you go, even into serendipity, that's where serendipity really happen in a way that is, I think, more appropriate to your own life.
Yeah.
You need to go in a very original destination to find original people. If you stay at home, you might really not find that person that really will, satisfy your curiosity or challenge you in a way that will bring more out of you. That's what she did for me.
Wow.
Yes, I would. And we often joke, her and I, that when we met, we didn't even like each other.
Yeah.
She was very...
Sounds like a Hallmark movie to me.
She really didn't think that I was, that hot or that interesting. And it actually...
Has that changed?
Well, it's a bottle of tequila that changed everything.
Of course.
And I think it will change, but she still keeps me on my toes. She is that type of person that I really like. That I actually have found quite a bit in America, that is both self-deprecating but also very self-determined and doesn't mince her words. So I never regretted, and I think she doesn't, that I followed her and that we made a life together.
That's interesting because we were talking about my French lessons, and I've been doing it different ways online. I've professors all over the world, but I have one here, the Alliance Française in Pasadena, and all the women that have come to America to either teach French or a French school, or I only cross their paths because they're teaching French, are very dominant and very driven and very much wanted to get out of the patriarch society of France and test their own toes in the water. I mean, some of them struggling still, but much prefer the opportunity to cut their own teeth than to be under whatever suppression, not to say oppression, but that they were under France. I thought that, but I find it fascinating about all the French women I know in this environment, including the ones that sell me wine. 2 or 3 new ones that have come in recently, and they're tough. They want to make a sale. They press hard. They remind me that I tasted their wines all the time, and that is interesting to me. Is that?
Well, yeah, I think that's. I'm so glad you talk about the patriarchy. I just listened to a podcast coming down here that I will give you that is phenomenal about that subject. But yeah, the patriarchy is strong there. It's actually strong here. I feel that what you say is also that these women have traveled. And again, that's to my point that when you travel, you find yourself a little bit more, and you find yourself also a little bit more alone. So you have to find a stronger, deeper footing for your personality and for your way of living, as opposed to if you stay home or if you stay in your neighborhood or you stay in your little kind of comfort. In many ways, that doesn't teach you how to be more determined. And that's whether you're a woman or a man. Then it's not maybe gender anymore, but I was also leaving France complaining about how hierarchical the society is. So it's patriarchal for sure,
yes,
but it's also hierarchical. It's also sometimes stuck in the past. It's also, and I really love French culture, but there are really a lot of aspects that are dysfunctional because of being so set in its ways.
Yep.
When you travel and when you basically become more vulnerable, you also learn to be, I think, more open and more directed.
It's interesting you said that since you're from Lyon, and there's a huge Armenian culture in Lyon. In fact, we went to, I think I told you, I went to one of the churches, but on the way there, we stopped at the Armenian market, Bagdasarian.
That's right. I should be.
They have a famous spice. Like there's even restaurants in Lyon that say, poulet and the spice from this market. It's in the middle of the Muslim district, though. I can't remember the name. It's fascinating to go into. They gave us a tour, took us underneath. But the Armenian culture is similar to what you're saying, and I grew up at the beach in Southern California. My father's from Cairo, like I told. My mom's Armenian. I'm 100% Armenian. My parents speak Turkish in the house. My wife speaks Armenian. My kids speak Armenian. I don't speak Armenian. But there's something to be said about that culture in that game. I'll probably get in trouble for saying this, but it's hard for some to break out from that culture, to say, well, and both my daughters so far, one's being married to a non-Armenian and the other one already has married a non-Armenian. Perfectly fine with that for me. They're great people. And more important for us is that they take care of the kids and they have a good life together. But the Armenian culture is pretty tight-knit. You had friends in Lyon that were Armenian. Were they?
Incredibly tight-knit.
Yeah.
And same, there's something oppressive. I mean, there I was being 14, 15 with young boys and girls that were living under the shadow of the genocide and the never-ending stories of which two really went into deep depression for very long, because it's very hard to live with that past being so profoundly repeated. But anyway, I understand why it's happening, but it is oppressive.
It's hard to break out of it.
And it is hard to break out of it. And not everybody has to break out, but because I'm one of those breakaway, whether it's mine was not as strict and as intense, but today I actually do not completely believe in the idea of a country or any specific boundaries. I see always the beauty of blending in all possible ways. I do see the power of culture. And if we go back to wine, for example, it's interesting how I cannot shed my Frenchness. I cannot shed all these elements that really I carry with me, no matter how cosmopolite I am and how profoundly understanding I am of all these other cultures and all these other languages that have shaped me and transformed me. I'm still profoundly carrying those elements of my own culture, including, in this case, what I was finding out with wine, that I did have, without even knowing it, this amazing sensitivity for smell and taste.
Yeah.
The ability to talk about it, the ability to share it, the ability to seek out beauty in these realms of like finding the great ingredients, finding the great recipe and sharing that food and putting the relationship around food and beverages as a central part of,
I think culturally,
being with others.
It's part of your DNA, and I that's a very difficult part of humanity to sort through, because yes, you would want no boundaries, let's say, in a perfect world, but because of the cultural differences of the lands, the age of the lands, the age of the people, the age of there is such thing as an old soul, in my opinion. I have 3 daughters. One of them is a very, very young soul, and the other one is a very complicated old soul, the baker. You want something as not prehistoric, but as original as bread. As she just loves bread. That's as basic as it gets, right? And the French love bread, so it's an interesting thing. But and I think you're right, and I think your predisposition to that shows in your wines. And it brings me to a point, and I want to take you out of Philadelphia and bring you back to San Ynez so we can talk about your career here. But I have this conversation all the time, and I'm trying to sort through it. And you seem to be very articulate. Maybe you can shed some light on it. And that is the difference between, and you brought it up when we were tasting, a grape. The grape seems to be the great messenger of where it's from and its character and its history and the soil, not just the terroir, physical terroir, but the approach of the winemaker, the family that made the wine, all the things that go into what represents this bottle of wine. It's the only product that I can think of that you can take across the country, plop on the table like you have here, and say, this is who we are. And for some reason, and being Armenian, right? Noah landed the ark on Mount Ararat and planted grapes. He became drunk, as we all know, which was one of the side effects of wine. But there's something ethereal about properly made wine and its ability to messenger what it's about and where it's from. And I don't think that's an accident.
No, it is not. And yes, you are touching really to the heart of the magic of wine. Not every fruit can be transformed into a beverage that has that ability to relate the climate, the geology, the landscape, and the spirit and the culture of the people that grew it and made it. So yes, that is at the heart, I think, of what makes wine unlike many other products. Plus, once you, I love sometime in French wine comment, there is this tendency to anthropomorphize wine, which wine being like a human really has this course and this evolution, because wine can have a 20, 30, 40-year lifespan, and in that lifespan it will have all these phases as we do.
That's
it
true.
will have the brashness of and the discombobulated aspect of being a baby, or having the the intensity of being an adolescent, or having the creativity of being a 25-year-old, or having the wisdom of being a 70-year-old. And so yes, I think it shows and has that ability to show all these aspects. And for us, and that was the reason it connects with the Amazon and that study of ancient humans, is that ability to connect with nature, the nature of things. And it starts with planting. It's where you plant, and it's also how you grow it. Then there is a myriad of details, whether they are under your control or they are not.
It's like the original paleo diet, right?
That's right. Yes.
So you're in Philadelphia. You ran into the love of your life, and you in Bolivia. You came to Philadelphia. Did she ever finish medical school, or did you pull her away from there?
No, she's way more focused than I can distract her from.
And you came to San Ynez.
So she grew up in San Ynez, and she left to go to college, and actually also being in a family where they had always traveled. That's why we really were seeing eye to eye, first with her father and then with her. She was actually born in Indonesia. Her father took her to the Kalimantan region of southern Borneo, where he delivered his own daughter in the middle of Dayaks. I mean, he's one of those fascinating character that was taking huge risks. So that's part of their DNA as well as a family, and many other stories where they did really incredible things. So when we found ourselves in Philadelphia, her father, who was a very, very important figure for her, strongly lobbied for us to come back to California. He had grown up in DC and believed in California. He was like feeling that this was the promised land, really. He had such a reverence for the irreverence of California, for the creativity, the ability to reinvent yourself, and the immense curiosity that he would find in California. So under his lobbying, we started to look all over the state for her to do her a residency. And again, through crazy, really a serendipitous story, we basically, and she ended up matching at Ventura Medical Center. And so that was close to San Ynez. It was pretty ideal. And from there, I mean, I met a couple of her father's close friends who are amazing wine luminaries, one being Richard Sanford.
Oh, yeah, really?
Who was his closest friend.
Guy.
And I keep saying was because her father died in 2002 from cancer. But Richard, who is still very much alive, was instrumental in really giving me that last little bit of push and saying, like, this is an amazing job. And plus, he is such a visionary and such a proselytizer and enthusiast wine lover. So that was him. And then the second voice was Richard Longoya from Longoya Wine, and who is the one who directed me to Adam Tolmack from the Ojai Vineyard. And he said, and you need to go try to work for him, because he is, mostly unusual, maybe one of the most authentic, kind of driven winemaker in our area. And that's it. So I followed that just one sentence and send my resume that had nothing involving wine to the winery, got a call back.
That's funny.
Had an interview that we were just reminiscing recently with Adam. I showed up, had never tasted from barrel ever. And we have this, great interview, but at the end he's like, do you want to taste wine? I'm like, sure. And we start to do a barrel tasting, but Adam at the time was really known to do like extensive barrel tasting. So there we are going through 40, 50 different lots.
Wow.
And I don't know how to spit. I don't even,
Right.
For me, I can't spit. I see them spit, but I'm like, this is, a waste of wine. I mean, how could I do that? It goes against everything that I believe in. And so after tasting all these high octane wines, I mean, in that was the year 2001, the wines were pretty high in alcohol.
Yeah.
I was very, very buzzed. And at the end of the interview, at the end of the tasting, I thought, I definitely botched this.
I taste 60 wines, 75 wines on a Tuesday usually, and I spit them all, and I still...
Well, that's it. Yeah, I mean, even with the spitting, but without the spitting, it was, I thought, catastrophic. But I guess he didn't really see any problem with that.
Yeah,
and
that's good.
He called me back, and I started as a cellar hand.
My first wine, when my dad and I decided, and what happened was I was working with him for a few months, and we went to a Bordeaux tasting. It was a sit-down tasting. It was 20 Bordeaux's, and we got separated, and we tasted separately, and we compared notes in the car on the way home, and we were off our scoring system that I still use today, and we were all off by 2 of the wines. And he decided at that point that I could probably do this. That's what it takes. But
how old were you then?
It was 1987 or 88, so I was 30. And I'd already worked for corporate America in America. And I've also worked for a company that had nothing more than a fishbowl of business cards and a 2-line telephone. So I'd done from scratch, built a small company. But the point was, the first wine that he said, okay, it's time for you to choose the wines. I bought Richard Sansford's Pinot Noir. I mean, how risky was that decision, right? It's like one of the best wines at the time. One of the great classic wines is Pinot Noirs and his Chardonnays. So, and I got to meet him because in those days in California, and particularly Southern California, when you went to a trade tasting, Richard would pour his wines because it was in its infancy still, right, in the early 80s. I mean, the mid 80s. Pat Paulson, the famous comedian, would pour his own wines. Fess Parker would pour his own wines. The Raymond brothers would pour their own wines. Dickie Smothers would pour. And it was, what's interesting about the wine business at that point, it wasn't about their celebrity status. It was about the wine. And they were very approachable because the subject of wine transcends all the rest of the stuff that comes with celebrity status. So you get this job at Ojai, and did you replace somebody? Was there somebody there already doing this work, or you're the first guy in the door for this? You're a cellar rat, basically.
Yeah,
right?
I was actually the second employee. So he always had only one employee. I mean, he was doing a lot of the work with his wife, but there was an assistant winemaker at the time. So I did not replace anybody. It was just an additional person. And the first year actually was not hired full-time. I was still working as a waiter at a restaurant in Ojai, and also had a young son, so I was kind of the main caretaker of my son while my wife was working, incredibly long hours. And then it's the second year where really I got hired full-time, and then eventually went through all the different iteration of the job, which was, all the production, but then eventually also all the business aspects. So that's why today I am, Adam is still very much the winemaker, which is why our wines are so sharp. That's really the sum of his 40, plus years of really obsessing over the wine. But now it's a collaboration, so he really, counts on me to really have this constant exchange about like how and where we go with each lot. But it's also maybe being a little bit more of the face of the business, because I definitely developed a liking to explain really what we do, because you realize sometimes that it's easier to do and it's much harder to explain, and finding the words of, why does it taste the way it does, and what was the intent, and what is the greater context of those wines, has been really something that I have loved doing.
It's funny. You said pharmacist, and my dad was a pharmacist, and my mom used to complain that he'd come home in the days of experimenting and researching drugs, smelling like the cough syrup additives, the flavors. But I also credit his keen palate to those days of early research and tasting chemicals. And in fact, part of what I inherited, so to speak, from when I bought the company was a whole kit of chemicals, tartaric acid and potassium and all these flavors that you otherwise may not detect, but he'd make me put my finger in and taste them. And so your background in biology, and you wanted to be a pharmacist, do you think that had any value to, because doing what you did, it's not uncommon. I mean, it's not common, but I've seen it where you enter the winery as a helper, and you end up in the lab making wines and doing whatever it does to make wines. And that's a fascinating thing, because you didn't set out to do this.
No, I mean, that's where everything that you learn is relevant. I had someone yesterday asking me a question as we had an extensive conversation about philosophy, how that pertained to wine. I'm like, yes, it completely does. And I proceeded to make that connection. So I would say biology for sure, because we try to be quite scientific in streamlining how we make wines, to try to coax nature that is very chaotic into something that's going to be a bit more predictable, so that we can reproduce the level of quality or the level of fragrance or the texture or the balance in the wine. And so it's exactly what you are saying. It's like it's the balance of acidity and base. So we are going into chemistry and biology. It is another subject I know you wanted to go to, which is yeast and bacteria. We are yeast and bacteria shepherds. So understanding those organisms and understanding what are the conditions, temperature, nutrients that will basically promote or prevent the growth of any of these organisms is really profoundly the understanding of biology and of science and of chemistry. And if I have this great reverence and great interest in ancient culture and ancestral knowledge, I also realized like the power that was unleashed with the technological revolution of the 19th century and the 20th century, that really brought, I think, in the wine world, the ability to just mitigate how chaotic nature is, and how I know that all this has allowed us to make much better wine on a much more regular basis than any other time in the history of humankind. So this is the reason why science was so useful, not just to be able to explain it or to have the right clout with the professionals, because that was important. If you can talk the lingo, you will get people to pay attention to you. But more important was to really understand the underlying systems that are happening when you are harvesting, when you are soaking that fruit, when you are breaking down those berries, when you are including the stems or not, when you are using sulfites, how much, when, what is the power of oxygen, or when can you harness reduction, and can reduction be positive, and under what condition? All these things are basically the tool of the trade. That's the palette of the painter.
But it's funny that you say it, because those are the tools of the trade. Those are the tools. I mean, we think about the monks in Burgundy. It didn't have those tools. They had whatever they had, but they recognized this radical change in terroir from across the street, and able to make wines of amazing character. And they didn't have the tools you had today. So,
well, actually, they did, and that's where I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt.
No, that's fine.
That's where my reverence for the ancestral world is infinite. Because our ancestors were far less actually distracted. And the monks would be a perfect example of both being not distracted and being very dedicated and very patient and doing a great job at taking notes. In many ways, they were the first great scientists. So that's all it takes. It's paying attention. And that's where our ancestors who have selected all those plants, whether it was in Armenia, which was one of the oldest winery that was found, that is 6,300 years old, is that our ancestors that, we imagine going around naked, bumbling idiots in nature,
making good wine,
were really selecting all these grapes and selecting the best one and doing hybridizing and doing all these things. They probably started 40,000 years ago. So they were paying attention. They were having that great quality of really having those tools of noticing amazing things.
I think it goes back to, that's a good point. I'm glad you interrupted me on that, because let's just take Armenian food, for instance. It takes forever to make traditional Armenian food because they had time to do it and they had time to experiment. And there are foods that take all day to prepare because that's what they did. And I suppose with the monks and they get to test, given they didn't have all the testing tools and hydrometers and things like that, but they were able to use the tools that were at their fingertips to craft what they were doing. But there's something, and the piece of it, which is why I started that comment, the piece that is interesting. When my daughter graduated from cooking school, after she went to the Alain de Casas pastry school, she went to cooking school in New York. And almost invariably, the chefs will tell you, they'll either tell you, half of them will tell you to go to cooking school, and the other half will tell you just go to a restaurant and start cooking. Because it all ends up with the passion of it, right? So all the tools you use, mechanical tools to biological tools, deciding what yeast you're going to use, and we'll talk about that in a second. But without the passion, without the absolute desire to make the best that you can make from the tools, the things you're given from nature, it doesn't work. And that's the key. And it doesn't work with food either. I mean, in my own kitchen, when I love to cook, I'm studying Escoffier's, sauces, I'm studying them. The first one I made, I couldn't eat it. It was so bad. And I realized after starting from scratch and making these things, how important it is to pay attention, to be focused, to make sure that you're extracting from the ingredient what it's supposed to do. And it changes things. It changes the way you see things. So there's an argument always, there's a discussion always at this table about inoculated yeasts that you buy from a catalog, natural yeasts, which are more sensitive to changes and sometimes can screw it up. What's your philosophy on the yeast you use to craft the wines you're making?
So we have done it all, right? I mean, that's where actually Adam is incredibly open. He straddles that line, being a scientist trained at UC Davis. But as he told me famously when I did this interview with him, when I asked him, should I go back to school or should I start to work? He basically said, start to work. Because he said, when I came out of UC Davis, I had to relearn everything. But you never forget that theoretical knowledge you got, so that becomes part of the process. So to go back to the yeast, I think he did a lot of native fermentation, but then really at some point in his life, he needed the control. So he did go to selected yeasts. So for a big portion of really all his successful years, it was with cultivated yeasts. Mm-hmm. I personally did not see anything bad about cultivated yeast. There are enough other parameters that are telling of the terroir, whether it's the culture of the person that makes it or if it is the year and the vintage and the climate. But today we definitely inflected towards doing our own culture. So we do cultivate very early on with the first sample in the year, a viable inoculant, and then we just keep feeding it throughout the harvest and with new samples or new lots that come in. So we basically do native yeasts. Yes, and I have loved that. To go back to, I shared something else with your daughter. Paradoxically, never made bread and baked bread when I was in France, except when I was on the boat. But it's Adam and his brother who taught me how to bake bread.
Really?
And that was coming from San Francisco, but also, so it's tartine, but it's the movement also that started with Nancy Silverton,
yes,
who was really their first teacher. And And there I've just realized the power of having your ambient yeast that you shepherd into your little starter that you keep alive and keep nourishing and putting away and bringing it back out, and how this is really what makes sense in further expressing something that is either yours or of your environment. Because it's not just the environment, it's also really very much human, and how many times you feed it, and when you feed it, and when you put it in the fridge, and how long do you leave it dormant in your fridge. Like, all these elements will profoundly change the taste of your bread. So in wine it's the same, and now this is really profoundly how we make the wines. We are constantly thinking of how we can shepherd those yeasts and not using anything that is cultivated outside of our environment.
So Nancy's going to be on this show. Her friend is a good friend of mine, Mike Krikorian, who's a used to be a LA Times beat writer, and she's volunteered to come on the podcast. So I'm going to go out to Mozza here in the next few weeks and talk to her.
Oh, great.
As well as her pastry chef. My daughter brings home her yeast. So she takes it out of the refrigerator, puts it on the plane, gets on the plane, flies it home, puts it in our refrigerator, leaves us a little bit. I kill it, and then she takes it back. And I think she's going on, 6 or 7 years with the same starter that she uses. And now the source of the bread she makes at a restaurant called Benno. And my friends who listen to this podcast are tired of hearing about this, but it's an important part of the passion for bread. I mean, that's what it is, and a passion for wine. And I don't see anything personally unnatural about inoculated or cultivated yeast. They're natural. You're a biologist. It's natural. They're no phony yeast. They're just...
Well, I mean, that's what I'm going to take that segue because I love that conversation about what's natural, what's not. You could say that even the most petroleum kind of industrialized processed molecule is still being created by humans. We are nature, therefore we are no different than a yeast that is creating its own byproduct and its own molecule. And the need for us to always separate, I mean, we can say that certainly some of these poisons that we have created are very dangerous, and so we have the ability of selecting them. For me, there's not one that is more natural than the other. There's just one that is actually more sensitive than the other, because a lot of those cultured yeast are almost overtly powerful. They will give you results that are very, by design, giving you, let's say, a big rise, or in wine to have more color or certain fragrance. I have learned to love the weak yeasts. In some ways they keep your mind open to new fragrance and new texture. They also force you to be a little bit more attentive to anything that can go wrong, because it's true, there are rogue yeast that will give you undesirable flavors and fragrance. I taste them
all the time, by the way.
And so, that I think it forces you to be more attentive. And that's why having a strong yeast is not necessarily desirable. Having a weak one might be that much more interesting. That's maybe also why biodynamic farming can be considered hocus pocus. But in many ways, at the end, what it forces people to do is to really be in their vineyard a lot more, in their garden. And it is to just like consistently doing all these treatment or all these little acts of love and acts of communication with your plant that really makes that you know it better, and maybe it does know you better, that there is an outcome that then you can learn works incredibly well. That's again why our ancestors, without very advanced technology, were able to again have quite incredible gardens, and they just were mimicking nature, which nature is already perfectly good as it is. It has found its balance between the various different predators and the various different viruses and yeast and bacteria in its natural controllers, whether it is a specific herb, or if it's a specific bark, or if it is like some, critter or microorganism that ends up by controlling the population. And that's where I believe today the future of our agriculture, of our winemaking, of our food production should go is using these ancestral technique of polyculture and of paying attention, but satisfying our modern goals of having enough food for everybody and having the price being right and all these things. But yeah, it's a challenge, but it really is one that is worth going into without the hubris of the 50s and 60s, where we thought that petrochemical engineering was going to take care of everything, that we were going to eat those little pills and having those little dinner plates, and that we will never have to bother about food and agriculture anymore.
You know the French movie Comment Chef? It's a comedy. At some point in that movie, they make that food, the molecular food. I bring this up all the time, and it befuddles me, and maybe you can help me since you're in the industry, the biological side of this. You see these trucks full of vegetables and fruits going down the 5 freeway, obviously tons and tons of vegetables, but it never seems like the row of vegetables on the bottom, or the tomato or the lemons, are crushed. They've been modified to withstand this, right? And so that's at the expense of something, that these things can travel like this, because we know that a biodynamic tomato is not going to last that long, and it's going to certainly turn into tomato sauce if it's under a pile of weight like that. But at the same time, we have to feed the world, and organic farms don't seem to be able to produce the quantity of food required that otherwise conventionally farmed things. But in America, we have a problem. We've destroyed a lot of great crops, not farms, because we've introduced so many chemicals and insecticides that it takes years and years for it to filter out. But do you think that I taste two types of biodynamic wines here in organic? I taste organic wines and that are fresh and bright and representative, and clearly are farmed and made differently than what maybe a conventional wine is. And then I taste these really rustic things that aren't really pleasant to drink. But if you're to relish in the idea that they were farmed the way they were farmed, and there's a very rustic thing, and there's grass and spiders and snakes everywhere, if you relish in that idea, you savor the character because of that. But to me, after all the wines we taste here, they're not that pleasant. I don't want to sit down and enjoy that glass. The only way I can enjoy it is consistently remind myself that I'm drinking something that's really, really, really rustic.
I mean, there's no question that it's much, much harder to do these methods of farming and methods of fermentation and aging. And so, yes, it is very, very hard. I mean, you just tasted this no sulfite Syrah and Grenache that we make.
But pleasant to drink.
It is a wine that is very difficult to make, in that there are many things that can go wrong. And so, yes, it does require an extra amount of knowledge to be able to follow these two basically subject that you are mentioning, which is one that organic farming, and then having the aesthetic that you would like to see. So I think maybe because the ones that you are tasting, they have achieved one and they still have not quite found the second. So it's going to take time, but it's possible. And I feel that it is not that complicated. I will just go one step back. You were talking about like, how can it work that we produce enough food? I'm always struck that we produce too much. I mean, we know that 50% of all agricultural products are discarded and go into the wastes. So right now, there are more people that are dying from diabetes and being overweight than they are dying from not being fed. And that's actually throughout the world. That's Yuval Harari, one of these great new philosophers that wrote this amazing book called Sapiens that I recommend everybody to read. But
Sapiens.
It's already super famous.
Isn't that a logistical issue, getting the food to the places it needs to be rather than being able to grow?
Well, I mean, that's because, again, we need to abandon the model of hyper-concentration and go back to a model that used to work of micro production everywhere you are. there's even now production on high rises where they have vertical farms that are on the top of a high rise. I mean, some of these, a lot of Asia and actually China and Singapore are really ahead in trying to figure out how in an urban environment we can have like a really appropriate farming using very advanced scientific technology, but without using any of the harmful chemicals, and being able to have a production where you don't need transport. Why would we send alfalfa from the Central Valley to China? I mean, it's beyond me.
I suppose, yeah.
So we should not, like, all these things should be staying for the local market in at least more than it is, and go back to the 18th century where most of actually the wine that was produced was consumed locally. In many ways, this is why I'm like touring LA. I want most of my wine being drunk in LA.
Yeah, I agree.
I don't want it to be going all over the world.
I think that's very important.
Maybe small quantities, but at the end, I value my local market a lot more than any of those faraway ones.
All right, one last question, because we're going to probably get on an hour here, it looks like, which, because it's so interesting. I really appreciate the conversation, but I want your opinion on one thing, and particularly with the young millennials who are growing up with a different baseline of what's natural, what isn't, ingesting foods that are not modified. GMOs is a huge thing. And so if there's a book called The Third Plate by Dan Barber, who's the chef, one of the preeminent farm-to-table chefs in America, and where I learned much of what we were talking about. And he's talking about the fact that there's 40,000 hybrid strains of wheat. And you take a wheat and you hybrid it, one that lasts longer, one that grows taller, whatever character you want, and you crossbreed these things and you make another strain of wheat that does something different. How is that different, since you're a biology major, than a lab modified DNA? You're modifying it naturally somehow by crossbreeding. Now we go into the lab, and I'm not a biologist, so I don't know any of this. So I want the answers. And I'm going to do this in the lab and create this hybrid. Is there something unnatural about that?
Well, that's a deep philosophical question, and I don't really exactly know how to answer it, but Harari, again, addressed all these questions, and he will say, we ethically try to prevent having any of these crossover. So we will say hybridizing is fine, but just changing and introducing a new gene, that's kind of the limit. But he says historically, what we have banned, we always end up by doing. So he's like, it doesn't really matter how much we will prevent something from happening, it very often ends up by happening.
Yes.
And so for him, that's the reality of studying 200,000 years of human life. We end up, and there are always unintended consequences, of which his major, for example, hypothesis is that, for example, unintended consequences of the agricultural revolution, which was 40,000 years ago, and it did happen again in that same crescent of the Middle East. It was thought to take care of all the problems of all the ills of not having enough food, but at the same time it had the unintended consequence of having a population explosion, and that people started to actually work more. It created actually the fact that people became sedentary, and once you are becoming sedentary, you have a piece of land, so you become protective of your piece of land, so it's property. With property comes conflict and war, and so you have something that was a great idea that possibly brings all these weird unintended consequences.
That's really fascinating.
And I think it's the same with starting to mess up with the DNA, and we are no different than any other carcinogenic that will change the DNA. Maybe we are just no different than cancer that will change the DNA of the plant. I don't know. That for me is beyond my understanding, so I cannot say if it is bad or if it is good. And my only guiding principle is that we are nature. One of the greatest, I think, source of pain in human is having tried to separate ourselves from nature. We try to put ourselves above and beyond, But really, one of the truth I found traveling and in my own life journey is that we are nature, and we are part of nature. And as nature is perfect as it is, and we are perfect as we are. And we just need to respect ourselves and respect the world as we see it. And yes, when we see something that creates an ill, we should really actively try to work at correcting it. And that usually is correcting the greed and the desire of very few to capitalize all the wealth against everybody else. It's, lending a helping hand to others, is realizing that we are all in relationships. That's why from one country to another, it doesn't make sense that we would be at war with each other. Mm-hmm. It's understanding that we need to collaborate and that we are profoundly all interconnected. And that maybe could be a parting word, but this is what I learned from those Amazonian culture. They profoundly have to teach us something about how we are all part of the same fabric. And when you do something on one tiny little side, it has repercussion on the other side of the world. And denying that, as we have tried to do it in the last 3,000 years, is a mistake. And there is no way that we can escape that reality.
That I think that's a great way to end this conversation, so that people just go away with something thought-provoking to mull over. And but the name of the book, Harari.
Yuval Harari, and it's called Sapiens.
Sapiens, yeah. Check that out.
It's basically 200,000 years of human history concentrated. And his thesis is like, what has made Homo sapiens take over the natural world in such an efficient way? And his answer, or his hypothesis, is that because we don't know, but probably a mutation in our brain, we suddenly were able to create fiction. That as far as he can tell, we are the only animal that creates fiction.
That's interesting.
And with fiction, we were able to collaborate past 150 individuals, which is the maximum that baboons can collaborate together, because we created myth. And then eventually the most successful of all fiction is money. And because money doesn't exist and most of our myths do not exist, the function is that it allows us to, although we are small and we are weak compared to many other forces in nature, we banded together with those fiction that allowed us to work together without having to vet each other over and over again.
And we can make wine.
And we can drink it together.
It's been a pleasure having you on the show, Fabian. I would like to do this again and continue the conversation. It's really fascinating stuff, and I think what I'm going to do when I record the preamble of the show, this is a great philosophical conversation. We didn't get to the wine as much as I wanted to, but we're going to do that again.
Excellent.
Cheers.
Cheers.